Welcome back, everyone. Dan Vega here, Spring Developer Advocate at Broadcom. Today, we are answering a question from one of you. And before we jump into that, I want to talk about some options for getting your questions answered. So you can always send me an email, danvega@gmail.com, probably the best way to get a hold of me. If your question is relevant to one of the videos I'm making, go ahead and leave your comments on YouTube, and I will try to get to them there. If you're on the Bird app over on Twitter, you can go ahead and reach me at @TheRealDanVega. Go ahead and follow me there. Send me a direct message. I will see if I can answer it there. Finally, a really good option is springofficehours.io. I'm not sure if you're aware of it yet, but this is a weekly live stream that we've turned into a podcast where we try and keep you up to date with everything that's going on in the Spring ecosystem, as well as answer your questions. So if you want to get your questions answered live, please come attend one of our live streams or check us out on your favorite podcast player. With that said, we're going to answer today's question. And the question is, what is the difference between the new JDBC client in Spring Boot 3.2 and Spring Data JDBC? I thought this was a really great question. Especially if you're kind of new and not sure what Spring Data JDBC is or Spring Data in general, this is a really good time to talk about this. So what I want to do today is create a new application. We'll use Spring, we'll use Java 21, doesn't really matter which version of Java you use, I guess. I guess in this case, using Spring Boot 3.2 is important because we're going to take a look at the JDBC client. But what I want to do is go through kind of a progression of how we might read some data from a database using plain old Java. We'll talk about that. We'll move up the stack to Spring. We'll take a look at something called the JDBC template, which has been there since 1.1. We'll move on to the JDBC client and see what problems that solves. And finally, we'll round it out by taking a look at Spring Data JDBC. So I hope you're excited. I hope you learned something today. And with that, let's write some code. All right, so I will share this repository in the description below, but you can find all the code that we're going to walk through today here, as well as a nice README that kind of guides you through this. So here's the question. Here's what we can do to get started. You can create your own project over at start.spring.io, or you can click this link, this handy little link here, and it will basically populate everything for you. So today we're creating a new Java project using Maven, using Spring Boot 3.2. We filled in some metadata here. We're using Java 21, although again, it doesn't really matter. I think you can go ahead and choose Java 17 if you wanted to. From a dependency standpoint, we're going to start by building a web application. So I'm going to choose Spring Web. We just need the JDBC API to start with. This is the database connectivity API that defines how a client might connect and query a database. Now, there are a couple different routes that you can take here. If you're not comfortable with Docker and using Docker Desktop, if you don't have that installed, then you could just use an H2 database. That will be fine. You may need to alter the DDL script there. But in this case, I'm going to use PostgreSQL. So I'm going to say I need the PostgreSQL driver. And then I'm going to choose the Docker Compose support. And I've done videos on this in the past. I will try to leave a link in the description to those. But this just will kind of allow me to automate some of that. It will create a Compose file for me with a Postgres database service. It will automatically start that up, and it will automatically inject those properties into a property source at runtime. So I don't have to do any of that. So this just makes downloading this project very easy to do. You can come over here and git clone run this particular repo without having to set anything up. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and generate this project. I'm going to open this up in my favorite IDE, which is IntelliJ. You can open it up in whatever text editor or IDE you're most productive in. With that, let's write some code. All right, so in this application, we are going to be creating a simple blog application modeled around the idea of blog posts. So the first thing we need to do is talk about the database that we're connecting to. Again, in my example, I chose the Docker Compose support. So we're going to connect to a database here called, I'm going to name it blog. I'm going to give it a username and password of user and password. So I'll say user password. And I'm just going to do something else here. So this port in Docker Compose, this is basically going to give us a dynamic port now. And I want to be able to connect to this using my database tools here in IntelliJ or whatever other database tools you're using to inspect the database. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to map the port 5432 on the container to my local port of 5432. So it's not using a dynamic port. I now can connect to the database here in IntelliJ. So I should be able to go ahead and run the application here. It sees the compose.yaml by convention, goes through, creates a service, and starts it up. And now the application is started up. So before we do anything, I'm going to go over to the database. I'm going to create a connection to that data source. So we're going to come in here and say Postgres, and we'll have a username of user, a password of password. We're running on 5432, and the database name is blog. So let's go ahead and hit apply and hit OK. And it looks like we have a connection. There is no data in there yet. There's no table yet. But that's okay. We can go ahead and do that now. So the next thing I'll do is I'll come into resources and I'll create a new file. And I'll say this is called schema.sql. And we'll go ahead and drop some schema in here. So this is going to create a new table. You'll notice my comment here. I'm doing this for demo purposes, just to kind of act like H2 and restart, kind of clean everything out on restart. But obviously for you, if this is going into production, don't do that. So I create a new table called post. It has things like ID, title, slug, the date, time, how long it took to read, some tags, and then a version, which is kind of specific to an example we'll look at later. And then I just use this to insert into post. I insert a single value. This is our first post. We should probably have a body in here and just noticing that, but that is okay. So we have a post in the database, and then we should be able to look at it. Now to run this, you'll need to set one setting because we go ahead and look at this by convention. So we're looking for schema.sql. If it's an embedded database, we will automatically run this script. But if it's not embedded, like ours, PostgreSQL, we need to go ahead and say, okay, it's okay to go ahead and init that. So I'll say spring.sql.init mode equals always, and then I'll go ahead and rerun this application. And what I'm hoping now is it starts up, and we can come over to our database tools. We can refresh this, and we see a table here. It is post. And if I double click on that, we see our one post. So this gives us a connection to a database. We have a database. We're able to see that one record in there. This gives us a foundation for everything that I want to walk through in this tutorial. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is create a new package. I'm going to call this post, and I'm going to need a new post record in here. So I'm going to say new Java class. We'll call this post. This is going to be of type record. I'll go ahead and put these on separate lines. So I'm going to have a string for an ID. I'm going to have a title. I'm going to have a slug. And again, this is kind of lining up with that schema that we just created, right? So I'm going to say a local date for our date, a time to read, and then finally tags. So this is everything that is in the schema except for version. So again, we'll come back to that when we get to Spring Data. But this gives us what we need to basically have an object that represents a post in our system. So now that I have a record in the database, I need a way to read it. And I'm going to go ahead and create a Java class. I'm going to call this post service. We're going to mark this with the @service annotation, so Spring kind of picks it up for us. Now, the first route that we're going to go is by using plain Java. So we're going to talk about data access in Java. When it comes to connecting to a data source and accessing data using JDK, there are two primary packages that you're going to look into, java.sql and javax.sql. So the first thing, we're not going to go through every single step. This would get very exhaustive if we just talked about some of the Java low-level stuff. But one of the things we'll actually need to make this happen is something called a data source. So if we look at data source, that's in javax.sql. This is the factory for connections to a physical data source that this data source object represents. Now, fortunately for us, that has been created by Spring already, so we don't have to do all the way low level what's happening in Java. We have access to that data source. So I'm going to say private final data source. We'll get this through constructor injection, and then Spring will go ahead and wire one in for us. So I want a method to list out all of the blog posts in our database. So I'm going to say list of posts. We'll call this find all. And inside of here, we need to use our data source to go ahead and get a connection. So I'm going to say data source.get connection. What is that going to create? That creates a connection. So this is another one of those classes here. You could see this has been around since Java 1.1. This is in the java.sql package. Again, these are the APIs for working with databases in Java. They've been around forever. So we'll go in here and we'll add this exception. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and paste some code in. It doesn't make a lot of sense to talk through all of this today. We could do that if you want in another video, but I just want to show you that, hey, to make this happen, we needed a data source connection. We need to get that connection. Using that connection, we can make a prepared statement. Prepared statement is part of java.sql. From there, you can use a prepared statement to execute it, and what that will return is something called a result set. Now, with the result set, you can iterate over that, and you can use that result set to get at the different columns. Like, hey, I need to get a string because that is what the ID is in the database. It's a string. So get a string, here's the column, and that'll work out. So we could see that we don't have a version yet, so let's go ahead and just get rid of that for now, and then everything should be okay. So I create an empty array list of posts, and then for each one in the database, I go ahead and add it to that array list, and I just return that. So this should go ahead and work. If we wanted to go ahead and test this out, we can do so in our application class. I could create a new bean. So this could be of type command line runner. The command line runner will go ahead and execute after the application is started up and the application context is ready, which means we have access to any of the beans or components defined in our system. That means I can get access to the post service. So I could say post service, return args, yes, and then inside of here, we could go ahead and get those posts. So I'm going to say list of posts. Posts is equal to post service dot find all. We should get all of those, and let's just go ahead and print them out to the console. So I'm going to go ahead and rerun this application, and if everything worked okay, we should see our posts, and we do. There's only one. It printed it out to the console. So this works, but again, if you take Spring out of the picture, then it gets a little bit harder, right? There's a lot more things that you got to manage. Spring managing just this data source for us and the connection pools did a lot for us. But still, the process of having to access data and persist data to a database is not the easiest thing to do because of the APIs. The APIs have been around forever. They are backwards compatible. So they need a little bit of love, right? We need to find an easier way to interact with our databases. And this is where we will bring in Spring and talk about some of those different options. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop this. I want to just rip some of this out. Let's rip this piece out. We're still going to have a find all method right now. This is just going to return null. And we will go ahead and delete all of this. So we're going to remove that, and we're going to take a look at the JDBC template. So what is the JDBC template? Let's go ahead and open that up in here. So if we look for JDBC template, we will see this. This is the central delegate in the JDBC core package. It can be used directly for many data access purposes, supporting any kind of JDBC operation. Essentially, this is a wrapper. This is something this is an abstraction. This is going to help us with everything JDBC related. It also says in here, I believe, yes, this class executes SQL queries or updates, initiating iteration over result sets, and catching JDBC exceptions and translate them into common exception hierarchy. So there's a lot of things that this class does to really help us out. If you take a look at the structure, there's a whole bunch of things in here like, hey, if I need to get the max rows, or if I want to execute, if I want to get a query, there is just a lot going on in here, all right? This is a very large class. So if you take a look through here, you can see what this API will do for us. But this is going to help us simplify some things. So because we already brought in the appropriate dependencies, when we started this, we said, hey, we're going to bring in that Spring Boot starter JDBC, not data JDBC, just JDBC, the JDBC API. That would give us an instance of the JDBC template. So now we can say private final, JDBC template. We can get that through constructor injection. And now we can go ahead and use the JDBC template here. So what does that mean for us? That means we can say JDBC template dot and then query. We can see there's a whole bunch of overloaded methods. There's a lot going on in this API, and that's one of the reasons we'll talk about some other abstractions today, is because it can be a little bit confusing on what method do I use, which overloaded method is right for me in whatever situation I'm in. It can be a little bit confusing. I'm right there with you. But we're going to use this first one. This first one says, hey, I accept a string that is called SQL. So this is the SQL that we want to execute. And then the second argument is a row mapper. So if we look at that, we can see the row mapper here. And the row mapper is an interface used by the JDBC template for mapping rows of a result set on a per row basis. We had to map every one of those columns, like we had to say get a string for the ID because it's a string. So that's what we're going to have to create here. To do so, I'm going to go ahead and say query select star from post. And then the second argument is going to be that row mapper. So because it's a functional interface, we can just use a lambda expression here. So I'm going to say the lambda expression, and then we'll say new post. And then this is where we will basically do the same thing we did before. So I'm just going to kind of copy this in here because we're just using a way to get at each of the columns. So I think, yeah, so we'll probably finish that off there. And then that will probably finish that off there. And there we go. So now we've kind of simplified that code. And I know there's a lot going on here, but we're not dealing with things like prepared statements and connections and data sources and result sets and trying to iterate over them. This is vastly improved that code that we just looked at before. So now if we go ahead and restart this application, because it's all wired up the same, this should just go ahead and work and output our single post, which it does. All right, so that was good. But again, we can see that if we start to build out this entire API here for the post service, like our find all, our find, we're going to use row mappers all over the place. When we start to get into like creating, updating, and deleting, it can be a little bit confusing on which methods to use, which overloaded method to use. So we get a little bit pretty verbose here as well using the JDBC template. Now the JDBC template's been around probably since the beginning of spring, and it was that abstraction on top of everything that we looked at in the JDK. So let's see if we can improve this. We are running on Spring Boot 3.2, so we have access to the JDBC client. Again, the JDBC client is new in Spring Boot 3.2, but if you're using that, we have auto configuration for that, so we should be able to just say JDBC client, get this through constructor injection, and now here we can say JDBC client dot. And notice that once I hit dot, I'm not giving this long list of 100 or 200 methods with all these different overloaded options. I'm simply presented with a .SQL method. So that SQL method is saying, hey, what is the SQL that you want to execute. This is because we have this nice Fluent builder style API. We're going to use SQL, and then based on that, then there are some other operations that we can perform. So I'm going to say .SQL, and all I want to do is select star from post, or even, we could get more specific, but I'm fine with this for now. Whoops. And then what do I want to do? There are a bunch of methods here for doing different things. Like if I had to pass a param, I could. If I wanted to run a query on that, I could. Here's the nice bit. Now, if we look at this .query method, there are a couple different ones. You can say, you can pass in a class, which is a mapped class. Like, hey, I want to map the results of this to this particular class. Or you could pass in a row mapper. So if you want to pass in a row mapper the same way that you did with the JDBC template, you could. But I like this idea of using a mapped class. This means that if everything lines up correctly, I can just pass in this post record that I have, and that should work. Finally, all I want to do is turn this into a list, and that is going to return me a list of posts. I don't know about you, but this is significantly simplified, especially when we get into building larger applications and we have more than one kind of service here. This is really easy on the eyes. So I'm going to go ahead and restart this. I want to verify that this still works and outputs our single post, and it does. All right, so we've seen some different options here. Now I want to take a look at Spring Data, and more specifically, Spring Data JDBC. So if we go over to spring.io and go under projects, you will see Spring Data here. So you can click on this to learn a little bit more about Spring Data. This is the umbrella project. There are a bunch of different modules when it comes to Spring Data JDBC being one of them. But Spring Data as a whole, the mission is to provide a familiar and consistent Spring-based programming model for data access while retaining the special traits of the underlying data store. That is because different data sources, different databases do different things, and we want to make sure that we kind of retain those. So I'll let you dig through the documentation, what the features are, what the modules are. If you want to learn more about what JDBC is, you can kind of dig in here. This is just kind of showing the progression, and I want to show it to you through an example. Okay, so we're going to come in here and remove this. I am going to remove this. So the first thing we need to do is go into our pom.xml. Instead of just using Spring Boot Starter JDBC, I am going to use Spring Boot Data JDBC, right? So this is the data starter. So I want to bring in that support. So with that simple change, that is going to give me what I need. The first thing I want to do is go into my post. Again, this isn't going to be a tutorial on Spring Data JDBC. I have other tutorials on the channel for that. There's also some really great guides and documentation over on the Spring.io site. You can check that out there. Here I'm going to add an @ID annotation. That just marks that as the ID. I'm going to add an @version annotation, and I'm going to add a new column here, integer version, and that is just going to help us deal with when is this going to be a new record, or when is this going to be updating an existing record. And so again, dig through the documentation to learn a little bit more about that. So with that in place, now what I can do, I can go ahead and create something called a repository. So we're going to say this is a post repository. Did I spell that right? I sure didn't. Post repository, and this is going to be an interface that extends something called the list CRUD repository. It takes in a type and an ID. So in this case, the type we're working with is a post. The type of ID that is in post is a string. So we'll say string, and that's it. Now we have a post repository. So this will allow us to get all of the CRUD functionality we need without having to write any of the SQL. So if we dig into list CRUD repository, we can see there are 3 methods here. one for finding all that return a list, find all by ID that returns a list, and save all that returns a list. The rest of the CRUD methods will be in the CRUD repository. The reason for the list CRUD repository is it just overwrites these find all methods that return iterables, because we're used to working with lists. Let's return a list instead of that iterable. If you want to return the iterable, then you can just extend the CRUD repository. So that's going to give us all the functionality we need out of the box. So now what I'm going to do is actually go into my schema.sql here. I'm going to comment this out so that, and we'll change some data. So this is not going to insert a post now. I'm going to insert a post for me. And the way that I can do this is I'm going to say, I actually don't even need the post service anymore. I'm going to say, hey, I need that post repository. Let's call that a repository. And what I'll do now is I'm going to insert a new post. I'll say repository.save. So again, I haven't written a save method that will persist a new post into the database. That's part of Spring Data now. So now I can say, hey, I need a new post. I'm going to give it an ID of 1, a title of Hello World. The slug is Hello World. Next is, I believe, the date, local date now. We'll give it a time to read of 10 minutes. And then I believe the tags, which are Spring Boot and Java. And then we need a version. We're just going to set this to null at first. So is that right? So that should be right. New post. Oh, that's right. We made this a string. So let's just say 1, 2, 3, 4. And now we should have a new post in the database. Now we can check this because we can say, I need to get a list of all the posts in the database. I'll call this post, but I'm going to use that repository. The repository has a find all method that will return all the posts. And then I can go ahead and print those out. So I'm going to rerun the application. Hopefully we see 1 in there. So it'll be a little bit different. That time to read is now 10 minutes instead of 5. So we know that we are inserting a new record here. That's where a lot of the power of Spring Data comes in. It solves a lot of these problems for us. It lets us think about other things instead of having to worry about all the kind of setup and CRUD functionality we need to do for each of the types in our system. Remember, we've been working off an example with one type, a post. This can get very verbose if we start to do it for all the different types in our system if we're using plain old Java or the JDBC template. So now I'm going to show you one more thing, the post repository. This is a Spring Data abstraction, the repository. You can go ahead and define your own custom queries too. So what if I wanted to get a particular post by its slug? I can say optional post find by, and you'll see I get this IntelliSense here, looking at all the different properties of my post record. And I'm going to say find by slug. And I think that will say also ignore case because I don't care about the case. So then I'm going to pass in the slug, and that's it. I'm just providing the method signature. I'm not providing an implementation of it. So now over here, once that's saved, I can say repository.findBySlug, ignoring case, and I'll just say hello world. That is going to return a post. And let's just go ahead and say by slug.get, and we'll go ahead and output that there. So let's go ahead and run this. And there you go. So we print out our one, and then we get it by its slug, and we were able to print that out there. So that's really it. That's what I wanted to go through today. I hope, first off, I hope I answered the question, what's the difference between a JDBC client and Spring Data JDBC? I hope that question was answered. With that, I hope you were also able to see kind of the progression that we've gone through over the years when it comes to data access in Java and SQL. If you're interested in more of a deep dive into some of this, please let me know. I'd be happy to do it. But I hope you learned something new today. If you did, friends, do me a big favor. Leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.